welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by, I always say this on the second visit. Once you're back twice, you are a friend of the show, so welcome back. This guest was here last year to talk about an absolutely amazingly entertaining and riveting mystery, and now we're back to talk about the sequel. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Jen. My name is Lina Chern, and my book that we are talking about today is Tricks of Fortune, due out on July 1st.
Oh my gosh, what a great follow-up to Play the Fool. And before we head into the new one, could you talk a little bit about, we were just talking before we started recording, the response to that first book, because it was so well received. You got the Mary Higgins Clark Award. Congratulations. And yeah, it was just such a wonderful welcome to that book into the world.
Thank you so much. Yes, the Mary Higgins Clark Award surprised me a little bit, but I was very, very honored and very pleased to see the response that Play the Fool got from readers and from judges, I guess. It was sort of a book that was very important to me and took a little time to get into the world. So I was very pleased to see it so well received.
Nice. I think Katie True, is just like by the end of the first book, like she is your friend. Like you love her. I loved her voice. I just loved her perspective. I really, really loved her humor. So could you just remind our listeners where we left her at the end of that first novel and where we begin?
Sure. So at the end of Play the Fool, Katie has, in a certain sense, I don't want to give anything away, has succeeded in solving the murder at the heart of the book, and the murder and disappearance of her best friend. And at the beginning of the book, she kind of starts off a little bit down on herself. She's sort of absorbed this loser narrative that everyone around her kind of saddles her with. And by the end of the book, I think she's realized that she can kind of use the skills that she uses in tarot card reading, intuition, reading people, all that kind of stuff. And she can actually use it for some good in the world. And that helps her be a little bit more secure in her own kind of footing in the world. So that hopefully will set us up for her next adventure in Tricks of Fortune.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I love where we find her. She is running her tarot shop out of her sister's old real estate studio with her friend Gina. And could you, I'm going to be as broad as possible so that you can reveal whatever you like to reveal. But in those circumstances, what happens in those first few pages that launches the mystery? Can you talk about what the inception point for that was? Like, did you think of a character first, or was it a plot point or just a vibe?
Sure. So basically, what happens at the beginning is that Katie and her friend are celebrating sort of the 1 year anniversary of Katie having opened up this tarot reading room. And it's kind of a happy occasion. And then by the end of the chapter, her best friend is arrested for the murder of a highly celebrated veteran police officer. And that kind of launches us into the mystery for the rest of the book. Because basically at this point, Katie obviously wants to know if her friend actually committed the murder. By doing that, she sort of gets involved in the murder investigation and that part sort of takes on a life of its own. And I'm not sure if this was actually part of your question, but I'll just go ahead and throw it in there. The inspiration for this book was actually a real life incident that happened in my community about 10 years ago. And that's sort of what I based this highly fictionalized version of that on. So basically the murder at the heart of this book is the murder of this sort of highly respected cop. And as Katie kind of delves into the murder, partially in the attempt to clear her friend's name, she finds out that there's a lot more to this case than meets the eye, obviously, and that this heroic cop who is so beloved by everybody is perhaps not who he appears to be or appears to have been now that he's dead.
I love how you play with hiding things and revealing things via the dual timelines. I really love talking about like how dual timelines can help you, shift attention and do read like almost like, sleight of hand or magic a little bit, allow you to draw attention to certain things while downplaying others. I'm always curious that when an author is approaching dual timelines, do you craft them each separately and then interweave them, or are they written like in dialogue with each other?
That is an interesting question. I'm assuming that you're referring to the other timeline being the sort of backstory of Katie kind of learning the tarot cards from her Aunt Rosie. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's something that is interspersed through the entire novel. And your question is actually very interesting because I played with a lot of different ways to kind of intersperse that whole thing. What ends up happening in that other timeline is that Aunt Rosie is teaching Katie specifically about the major arcana and sort of the trump cards, the ones that represent sort of these large ideas in life. And actually, one way to read the major arcana is to think of it as the human journey, the fool's journey, it's sometimes called, basically all of the stages that a human being goes through in life. And so that sort of set up a good framework for me to kind of intersperse the explanations of these cards throughout the novel. Now, what I tried to do, and I don't know how well I succeeded, but this is what I tried to do, was to kind of mirror that same journey in the journey that Katie takes through this investigation. And so her solving the murder case almost sort of requires the same stages that one would encounter in one's life. So I hope that I brought that across.
You absolutely did. That was like you predicted what my next question is. It was about like
Okay.
weaving in the major arcana to the narrative. And I was, curious about whether, yeah, that sort of human journey or story structure influenced your writing. And yeah, it sounds like it did. I'm curious in particular, like, has that always been the case for you? Like, has that always sort of been a way that you think about stories? Because I think it's so interesting to think about that alongside, three-act structure or five-act structure or like Dan Harmon's story wheel.
I'm sorry, the what ex can you
Oh, sorry.
can you repeat the question?
The
What
major
exactly influenced?
arcana.
Oh. No, I mean that was actually kind of a discovery I made while I was researching cards for both for Play the Fool and for Tricks of Fortune. Spoiler alert, I'm not actually as much of an expert in tarot cards as perhaps Katie is. So I actually have to do some research. And one of the things that's explained in the book is this sort of sequential nature, excuse me, of the major arcana. And that seemed like it just seemed like a natural fit to me. But it was also new. So I can't say that I've ever actually used that structure before in any other book. This was sort of the first time, and it just seemed like a natural fit to the story.
Yeah, oh, cool. Absolutely. When you were thinking about her childhood experiences that you explore in this book, how much of that had you had any of that figured out when you were writing Play the Fool, or did you think of those dynamics for this book? Because I'm always interested in like when you are writing a character's backstory, you sort of are like reverse engineering like psychoanalysis.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. I think in this book, I do get a little bit deeper into some of the family dynamics that I think were set up in Play the Fool. I just sort of went a little bit further into them, deepened them a little bit. I tried to kind of think of how Katie's family might have reacted to to some of the some of the backstory in terms of Katie's connection to this police officer. Because one thing I might mention is that Katie does actually have a connection to this police officer, which is another thing that makes her motivated to solve his murder. He actually saved her life as a baby. He saved her from a car accident. And so she feels this very intense connection to him and very intense interest in what happened to him. And I think one of the things that ended up being very character appropriate was sort of her own family's reaction to that incident and how it kind of shaped their view of her, and this sort of idea that she's maybe destined for great things, this sort of pressure that they put on her that she never feels like she's quite living up to. So that was something that really kind of dovetailed nicely with the family dynamics that were set up in Play the Fool.
Absolutely. And it sets up really difficult stakes for Katie in this story. It's sort of lose-lose for
Mhm.
her, you know? Like she either solves the case and has to, lose access to one of her very, very good friends, or she doesn't solve it and, leans into all those received narratives, that she has heard about herself. So yeah, it's very tense.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you.
One thing I mentioned before was Katie's voice, and I just love how funny she is, and the way that she speaks is just like so idiosyncratic and like really, really fun to spend time with. How did you like develop her voice, I guess, further in this? Because you've talked about her character growth, like between the first and the second book. Did you start to think about her voice in new or different ways, like because of that growth?
I think I mostly just try to keep in mind that she is a person who speaks her mind, maybe in ways that I myself might even be afraid to. So I guess when trying to figure out exactly how she would respond to a situation, how she would craft her response to a situation voice wise, I kind of always think to myself, okay, what do I really want to say in this situation, but wouldn't necessarily have the guts to? And that's usually what I kind of put in Katie's mouth is sort of a more amped up version of what I myself might say in this situation.
Hmm. That's interesting. And I think that that's a really good tip for writers who might be like people pleasers, right? Because I remember when I've
Yeah.
ever tried to write dialogue, I'm like, well, I avoid conflict all the time and stories need conflict.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I come upon that all the time. It's like, what would I say in this situation? That's not going to work. That's not really dramatic enough. I need something a little bit more forward or courageous or something like that.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the relationship between Katie and the victim, Matthew Peterson. I really I was really drawn into the way that Katie has to grapple with learning all these new things about this person who saved her life. And that I think in a not to get too psychoanalytic again, but I think it really mirrors a lot of people's experiences, like coming to terms with who their heroes or perhaps their parental figures or parents really are. So yeah, could you talk about crafting that dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's sort of one of the central themes that I tried to bring across in this book is sort of the stories that we tell ourselves about people in our lives or people who are in the public eye and kind of elevating them to a particular stature that they maybe don't necessarily deserve in reality. And this kind of that it's applicable to the murder victim, but also in a sense to Katie's best friend, whom she thinks of in a particular way, in this very sort of aspirational way. And then by the end of the book, hopefully comes to see her in a bit more human terms. But just to give you a quick overview of the murder victim's story is that and I think I mentioned a little bit of this before, he's this extremely venerated police officer. And then as the investigation goes on, it turns out little by little, all these things start dribbling out that kind of give the lie to that image, and which is exactly what happened in real life with the death, I should say, of Joseph Glinowitz, who was the police officer who was actually killed in 2015 that I based this case on. And and yeah, and I think it's just that's something that kind of goes on throughout the book, this sort of idea that um, a lot of the ways we think about the people in our lives are self-created. And I tried to kind of examine that idea and sort of the pitfalls of doing things like that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it kind of speaks to like a very natural part of like developing as a human too, which is realizing that like not only you, but everybody that you interact with is like a slightly different person for you than they are for others. And so you as
Mhm.
you are only ever going to really see like certain facets of a person that you don't have access to. Yeah,
Mhm.
everybody is a lot more complicated than perhaps we wish they were.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
I'd like to also talk a little bit more about how you managed to make this novel both a sequel, but also like self-contained to a very impressive degree. Obviously, like it's great to read the first novel first because then you are introduced to the characters and you really understand Katie's journey and all that. But like you can read it without having done that. So how do you balance like rewarding the rewarding the return readers and welcoming the new ones?
That is a really good question, and something that I actually had quite some help with from my editors, because I often am too close to my own story to see, it all kind of lives in my head, and I don't remember exactly what parts are already out there and what parts are just in my head. So that's where it really helps to have good readers and editors kind of working alongside you to make sure that you're keeping yourself kind of honest for the reader. And I did want this story very much to be self-contained. So that meant usually kind of putting in little touches of backstory or exposition where it was necessary for the story, but also just really trying to show things kind of as they happened and not necessarily having to depend on a lot of backstory. I also really enjoyed putting in little Easter eggs for older readers. There's a reference at some point when Jamie, Katie's sort of police friend, and Gina, her friend, are sort of they're kind of sparring verbally, and he mentions something about her having burned down a casino, which is or something like that, which is a reference to something that happens in the first book, and it kind of works on both levels. Readers of Play the Fool will recognize it, but anyone who hasn't read Play the Fool will just think, oh, that's kind of a funny thing that happened. So I tried to put in as many of those touches as possible without becoming obnoxious about it.
Yeah, it's sort of like it seems like it's about making your Easter eggs or your in jokes not exclusionary. Like if you don't understand the reference, like it's still information that you will need as a reader. So
Yeah, exactly.
very cool. Has writing these books, you mentioned that you did research on tarot. Has it changed your relationship with tarot at all, or do you think about it differently, or do you use it more or anything? Like how has it worked through your personal experiences?
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to find out more about tarot. My interest in tarot has always been sort of academic, I guess. I don't really I get asked about this a lot, and I don't necessarily believe that there's any actual magic or divinity or anything like that going on. I really feel like the cards are sort of emblematic of our tendency to tell stories, like I said, not just about each other, but about the world. They're sort of they're basically visual representations of existing ideas that have been around, since the dawn of humankind. And so I find them very interesting in that sense, and also as a way to kind of plumb the depths of your own subconscious. And I know that a lot of people who are tarot enthusiasts actually do use the cards this way. They basically sort of read for themselves in order to kind of gain some clarity about their own life and to sort of get through that barrier of consciousness that sometimes kind of keeps us from knowing ourselves as well as we could. So I still very much think of them that way, but I also occasionally actually use them to write, sort of for the same reason. I find that sometimes when I've kind of written myself into a corner and don't really know exactly where a story should go next, I will just draw some cards to kind of to jar myself out of whatever corner I'm in. And the way that started was actually when I was writing some of the tarot reading scenes in Play the Fool and also in Tricks of Fortune. I found that if I didn't know exactly where a scene was going to go, I would actually just draw, I would literally draw the cards that Katie is drawing in the reading and to kind of and have that dictate where the story went. And it was always so fruitful and so interesting and kind of surprising that I kept doing it. And I even started doing it as just a behind the scenes writing tool for myself. And I have to say that some of the most interesting, most surprising things have come out of that process, which just proves that tarot cards are really effective for that.
That's so cool. That is a really, really interesting idea to me that like the cards almost become like your brainstorm partner, like just the person that you are
Yeah,
bouncing ideas back and forth with. And yeah,
absolutely.
that speaks to me because I think like I've always collected decks because I find them to be like beautiful art objects. And I've
Mhm.
used them in that sort of more reflective way as well. And yeah, and I think that dovetails nicely with Katie even because it's just sort of like a way to connect to your intuition ultimately. Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Wow, this has been so great. And I'm like so glad that you shared your second novel with me. And,
Oh,
I never want to put too much pressure on writers, but do you think we'll see Nikki again or what's in store for her and for you?
well, I hope so. I've always kind of seen this series as at least a trilogy, so I have a few more ideas kind of kicking around that I'm sort of framing up right now, and we'll see where they go. I hope that they make it out into the world also.
All right, listeners, that means that it's your turn. You're going to, as of the airing of the show, go buy or go check out Tricks of Fortune so that we can know what happens to Katie next. I really want to know. Thank you again so much for joining us, Lena. This has been really lovely.
Thank you, Jen.
And yeah, thank you, listeners, for joining us as well. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.